This walkthrough will cover the installation of Apprenda's Kubernetes ACI integration. This guide assumes a working Apprenda installation on ACI, a dedicated AD account for this integration, and that any ESXi server hosting a Kubernetes node have at least one unassigned NIC cabled to one of the leafs in the ACI fabric. In our setup, we have created an Apprenda tenant for the Apprenda Windows nodes. We have also created an Apprenda contract in common for communication with the Apprenda Windows nodes. First, use pip to install Cisco's provisioning tool. ACC version 1.6.0 must be used for this integration. Pass the sample flag to the tool to generate your initial provisioning YAML. First, configure your system ID and the IP of your APIC. The value given to system ID will be the name of the Kubernetes tenant provisioned by ACC. As evident by the sample YAML, Cisco's CNI relies on a pre-existing AEP, VRF, and L3 out. The AEP should be configured for the leaf ports cabled to the ESXi servers. In this setup, we'll be using the Apprenda VRF residing in common for bridge domains in both our Apprenda and Kubernetes tenants. Next, decide on the subnets that you'll be using for nodes, pods, dynamic external IPs, static external IPs, and services. In this setup, we'll be using the 10.1.1.1/24 subnet for nodes, the 10.1.2.1/24 subnet for pods, the 10.1.3.1/24 subnet for dynamic external IPs, the 10.1.4.1/24 subnet for static external IPs, and the 10.1.5.1/24 subnet for services. Next, decide on the VLAN IDs that will be used for cluster management traffic, service traffic, and ACI infrastructure traffic. In this setup, we'll be using VLAN 4001 for cluster management traffic, VLAN 4003 for service traffic, and VLAN 4093 for ACI infrastructure traffic. Your ACI infrastructure VLAN ID is available under System Controllers Interfaces on your APIC. Use the provisioning tool with your provisioning YAML to initialize ACI. This will not only generate the YAML for installing Cisco CNI, but will also create the physical domain, Kubernetes tenant, and the necessary common contracts in ACI. Once complete, configure the kube node and kube system EPGs to consume the Apprenda contract. The next part of the configuration takes place in vCenter. As described in the Preparing Kubernetes Nodes section of Cisco's documentation, each node requires an additional ACI uplink interface. First, configure a switch and assign it to the host NICs that are cabled to the leaf. Set the MTU on the switch to 1600. Next, create a port group and configure it for VLAN trunking, and enable forged transmits. Finally, create an additional NIC on each Kubernetes node and assign it to the port group. Take note of the MAC address assigned to each NIC. The next part of the configuration takes place on the nodes. First, identify your uplink interface by MAC. Second, use the provided bash script for configuring the nodes. At the top of the script, configure your domain settings, uplink device settings, Kubernetes API VLAN settings, and infrastructure VLAN settings. Running this script will configure the OS for running Kubernetes with Apprenda and create the VLAN interfaces required by the ACI CNI. Once complete, mark your management interface as not the default route and reboot the node. You should now be able to connect to the node on its node subnet IP. This process must be completed on each of the Kubernetes nodes. You are now ready to install Kubernetes using kubeadm. We'll be using the provided YAML to set up the cluster. ABAC must be specified as the authorization mode for the cluster to be usable by Apprenda. In addition, you will need to place the included ABAC policy.json and basic-auth.csv into Kubernetes' configuration directory. Pass the YAML to kubeadm to begin the installation. Once completed, copy admin.conf to your home directory and set the kubeconfig environment variable in your bash profile. Execute the join command on each of your nodes to add it to the cluster. You can check the status of your cluster by querying the nodes and by querying the system pods. If you are using a pod IP pool smaller than a /16 default subnet, pod IP pool chunk size must be set to something smaller than its default 128 value. In this example, we've used 4. Now, apply the YAML generated by Cisco's provisioner to install the CNI. Once kubedns deploys, the container should be visible under Kubernetes kubesystem operational. To attach the cluster to Apprenda, install the cluster CA certificate as a local computer trusted system root on all app and web servers. The cluster can then be added to an existing Apprenda cloud in the SOC under Infrastructure Cloud's Kubernetes clusters. In this example, we've added a DNS record that points to the Kubernetes master node. This is important since the common name on a certificate must match the server's URL. Next, use the provided Powershell scripts to install the integration. First, run generate certificate. The resulting certificate will be used for encrypting credentials stored in the database. Second, copy the certificate and provision node to all app and web nodes. Run the script as administrator to install the certificate and set the required permissions. Supply the integration's dedicated AD account credentials to the script. Third, use configure archive to embed the integration's AD account credentials in the archive. Fourth, use configure Apprenda to deploy the integration. Passing the optional ACI and Kubernetes credentials to the script will save them in the database. This script is responsible for deploying the integration, creating the bootstrapper, configuring permissions, and configuring the applicable Apprenda registry settings and custom properties. Now, use the integration's web UI to set credentials if unspecified before. Finally, check the status of the integration services in the integration's log.